You're listening to audio from the Decidedly podcast. For more information, find us on Instagram at Decidedly Podcast.
All right, I have a question for you. What's the most difficult thing you've done physically? Like just hard physical thing?
Man, it's a hard question. I would say I thought about saying doing an Ironman triathlon. But, I don't know. I trained so hard for that I don't know if it was really...
The actual triathlon wasn't
I think
the hard
it was
part.
getting hazed in college. So
let me hear about that.
So I got hazed one time.
Wait, I thought they did away with that and you weren't supposed to do that.
No.
No one believes that.
Well, first of all, you want to get hazed.
I think it's an important part of the process.
It's part of the fun. Like if you don't get hazed at all, then you don't have any fun stories like the one I'm going to share.
Right.
So it was Thanksgiving. We had a football game. My sister was visiting she was in high school at the time. She was visiting from home and she had a friend drive her down and I was going to drive her back home.
Gotcha.
So that we could have Thanksgiving, as a family.
Mm-hmm.
The game ends at 10 o'clock or something.
All right.
And I go back to the dorm and one of the, upperclassmen, his name's Alex.
Right. It's important to note that you're in the Corps of Cadets now. So you all live together.
We all live together. This is a military school.
Right.
Yeah. So he says to me, hey, meet me in my room before you go anywhere.
And you have to, because he's an upperclassman.
Because I got to listen to him. Right. So I go and I go to his room after I change clothes or whatever. He goes, no, come in PT gear, like physical training gear.
Uh-oh.
And I'm like, oh, God dang. So I'm going to do some push-ups, whatever.
Right.
So I go over there and he has 2 canteens for me.
Okay.
One was full of cold water and one was full of hot water. Actually, no, he made me fill them up myself. They were empty. And he goes, turn the sink on. So this is sink water. Turn it on hot.
Like that's bad. Like that worse than other water?
That's way worse.
What are you talking about?
Drinking water out of the sink? That's disgusting.
People do that all day.
Do you drink water out of your sink?
Yes.
No, you don't. You have a fridge full of bottled water.
Anyway.
You have a habit of talking about the least important details of the story.
Go ahead.
So he says, fill it up with hot water, fill it up with cold water.
Okay.
I fill it up. And he goes, okay, chug them. So I chug both of them, which is disgusting. And
which
horrible.
one did you do first?
I don't remember.
Okay.
And then he says, okay, cool. Do 100 push-ups. So I do 100 push-ups. And I think I'm done. I'm like, it's really hurting my stomach because I just chugged a bunch of water and the hot and the cold made it really it worse. And then he goes, okay, meet me at this building. And so we run across the campus to one building and then he gets there on a bicycle.
Okay.
And he says,
I see where this is going.
Do 100 sit-ups. And then he says, meet me at this building. And then he says, do 100 burpees. And we kept doing that over and over and over. He never told me like, this is the plan or this is what's next. He just kept saying next, doing one more, do one more. And then,
so you didn't know how long this was going to go on?
I had no idea. And then finally he says, meet me at the end of Nuke Road, which was 5 miles.
Okay.
Maybe 3 miles. I don't know. Several miles from our dorm.
3 or 5,
Whatever,
same thing at this point.
Several miles from our dorm. And I've already been running all around campus. So I go to the end of Nuke Road and he says, do 100 push-ups. I do. And he goes, all right, bye. And he left.
That was it.
And I ran back. And I got there and it was it was like 2:33 in the morning. So this was like 5 hours or so. No, maybe it wasn't that long. It was like 1 or 2. So this probably all in all lasted 3 hours, I would say. Because maybe I started at 11. Anyway, the next day he was like, do you know how far you ran? I was like, no. He goes, you ran 17 miles, which was my class year.
Oh,
so
okay.
That was hard because I didn't know. It was hard mentally. It was hard physically. That at the time, that was the longest I had ever run. I'd never run more than a 10K.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it with doing push-ups and sit-ups. It was pretty brutal.
Oh, I was in a fraternity. We never did anything as brutal as that. I think the worst was they rounded us up in the middle of the night one night and took us out and dropped us off in our underwear, to find our way home. Yeah, it was about as bad as it got.
Despite how difficult both of those things were, absolutely nothing compared to being a Navy SEAL. And our guest today did just that. He's Rich Diviney, a retired Navy SEAL commander who spent 20 years in the U.S. military and completed more than 13 deployments overseas. Rich was intimately involved with an extremely specialized SEAL selection process. What they would do is they would pare down a group of exceptional candidates to a small cadre of the most elite, optimal performers. He also spearheaded the creation of a directorate employing a strong emphasis on physical, mental, and emotional discipline to optimize the team's performance. Since retiring from the Navy, Rich has worked as a speaker, facilitator, and consultant at the Chapman and Company Leadership Institute and the Simon Sinek Incorporated. In 2020, Rich founded the Attributes Inc., where he currently serves as the corporation's CEO. Rich's book was released in 2021, The Attributes, 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance. We had a great time talking with Rich. We talked about developing attributes that influence your decisions, managing and overcoming autonomic arousal in your brain, making microdecisions, utilizing compartmentalization to make faster decisions. I know I learned a lot. I know that you will too. My name is Sanger Smith. As always, I'm with my dad, Sean Smith, and this is Decidedly. Hey, Rich, thanks for being here, man.
Gentlemen, thanks.
Hey, Rich,
thanks
welcome.
for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to not only have someone who can kick my ass, but who can kick Sean's ass too.
Rich could probably do it both at the same time.
Well, maybe, but I'm a former Navy SEAL. I'm not an active one anymore. So
and he's humble.
Look at that.
Look at that.
Thanks for having me, though. It's good to meet you guys.
So when did you go into SEAL training?
Gosh, I went into SEAL training in 1996, coming out of Navy ROTC at Purdue University. Graduated, got commissioned as an officer, as an ensign in the U.S. Navy, and went straight to BUDS, which is Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL Training, there in San Diego. And 96, and I graduated. Spring. Went there graduated spring 98, and then started my career. So
what possessed you to do that? What was the lead up in your life to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to go do probably the hardest thing that I can possibly think of?
Yeah, it's interesting. I grew up wanting to be a pilot, a Navy pilot specifically. I have a twin brother. My dad was a private pilot, so he'd take us flying on the weekends, and we loved flying. And my twin brother and I wanted to be jet pilots. And so we were thinking, this was like you're 6 or 7 years old. And we had a cousin who was a Navy pilot. And he was like, well, in the Navy, you get to land on ships. And we're like, wow, there's nothing better. I mean, that's got to be the hardest thing. So we both were bent on being Navy pilots. And this was pre Top Gun. So Top Gun only solidified it. But it was actually the first Gulf War. So in 1990-ish, I happened upon an article in a Newsweek magazine that kind of outlined a bunch of special operators, and so it outlined like the Air Force, PJs, Green Berets, Navy SEALs, Rangers, things like that. And what I noticed in this article, it was about, I would guess it was 6 or 7 pages, but there were probably peppered throughout it probably 20, 25 pictures of guys in all different environments. So some guys in snow, some guys underwater, some guys doing skydiving, climbing mountains and jungle. And what I noticed about the 25 pictures were like about 20 of them were all Navy SEALs, but they were just all in different environments. And I was like, wow, these guys seem pretty cool. They seem like they do everything. The fact that they were like waterborne really keyed me. And I grew up in Connecticut, right on the water, and so I loved everything about the water and being underwater. And so I kind of said, well, I might want to do this. Ended up in ROTC, and really my decision point ultimately, as I was getting ready to graduate, was I knew I could be a pilot, but I never wanted to wonder if I could be a Navy SEAL. So I just decided to go for it. And what's interesting is back then, very few people knew what Navy SEAls were. I mean, it was really just, it was hidden. We were kind of the black sheep of all the services. But I remember there was a commercial that came out. It was either mid or late 90s, and I think Spike Lee directed it. But it was basically a picture of a beach at night, and there was waves crashing on the shoreline. and then it went black. And then when it came back, there were footprints in the sand, like coming out of the water. And then the waves crashed over the footprints, and the footprints disappeared. And then it just said U.S. Navy SEALs. And I was like, that's what I want to be.
Nice.
I want to be an invisible ghost. I want to just be someone who comes and that's what really was the impetus. And so I found myself on the beaches of Coronado in SEAL training, and unfortunately I made it through.
Well, and fortunately you made that decision to join. Like, I think you get this a lot as a serviceman. Thank you for your service, but thank you more for the crazy people like you who go, you know what, I want to do not only risk my life, but I want to do the hardest crap that this organization is going to offer me. It's interesting hearing you kind of walk through the decision on becoming a SEAL. You started off with pilot because it was the hardest thing.
It was. But let me
I want to, what's the hardest one? Oh, wait, that's harder. Let me go do that instead.
It is. But I want to, it's funny you should say that, because I want to give a nod here. Growing up, again, I was in Connecticut. I was on the water, and one of my jobs was I worked at a marina, and I'd drive people out to their boats. I'd fill boats up with gas and things like that. Well, the night security guard that worked at the marina was an old guy, and he was a World War II Marine veteran, a veteran of World War II. So he was on the beaches of Iwo Jima, and we'd sit down with this guy, and this guy would tell us stories of like insane stuff, like charging the lines, and he I remember him telling me a story. He said, I remember being at it was a line of cover, and there was a distance of about 50 yards across this open beach area to another line of cover. And he said, well, I'm sitting there, and the first wave went, and almost all of them got mowed down by enemy gunfire. And he said, I was the second wave. And I thought, I was sitting there, I was thinking, and so I joke about this because it's like, we talk about doing the hardest stuff and being brave. It's like, I said to myself, I want to be the guy who sneaks up like behind the machine gunner,
right.
And
okay.
They don't know to shoot at me because they can't see me
before he ever shoots at me. Right. So there's definitely a level of courage in being a special operator, but courage comes in so many different forms, and yes, it's badass, but I really wanted to be a ghost. I wanted to sneak around. I wanted to be invisible. And that comes with a certain type of courage, because again, you're probably, most of the times we do that, you're on your own and there's no backup, so if you do get caught, you're pretty much, done for. But I tell you what, the service members, men and women who I've met and have served holistically, come to the game with such a level of courage that it's just hard not to look at everybody in that business as heroes. So just hats off to everybody.
Is that pretty normal to go straight in from college into SEALs? So what were you, like 22, 23, something like that?
It is actually. The enlisted path. So most people may not know this, may or may not know. Most Navy SEALs are enlisted, and so the enlisted pathway for SEALs is they usually join the Navy, and if they pass the test and they get selected, they go straight to SEAL training. There are certain cases where guys will laterally transfer from other parts of the Navy. But the officer pathway is typically straight from your commissioning source, whether it be the Academy, ROTC, or OCS, to go straight to SEAL training. Because if you don't make it, then those officers get put into a different service selection, and you don't get another chance to come back. So it's really, we get one shot and that's it. But typical that you go straight there and then spend your career in that field.
You got involved in selection or in recruiting in the SEAL teams? Is that sort of how your career progressed?
Yeah, well, actually, it was later on. So I did my first tour in Hawaii at a command in Hawaii. Moved to the East Coast right in 2001. So 9/11 hit. I was at SEAL Team 2, and then right around 2004, 2005, I got selected for one of our very, very specialized SEAL commands. Very famous one now. We weren't famous before, but we're the guys who got Bin Laden and Captain Phillips. So I got selected for that, went there, and spent pretty much my whole career there. And while I was there, one of the jobs I had was to run selection and assessment for that command. And that command was interesting because what we did there was we basically got applicants from all the other SEAL teams, and they were pretty much the top performers. They had to come with recommendations. They had to have experience. Get them to come to our command, and then we put them through our own 9-month selection course, and only about a 50% make it. So again, 50% attrition of the top dudes. And so I was in charge of that assessment selection. And one of the things that I did while I was there is I had to really kind of dive into and try to articulate what was going on there and how we were doing that, and try to really in some cases reshape it. So that was one of my most interesting and I think most enjoyable jobs.
When you see selection drop off like that, or attrition rather in the selection process, one way to look at it, I would think, would be, well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a crucible where that brings out the best of the best. How do you know if you're screening on the right thing? Because in other words, if you go into a situation, it's just horrible, bad leadership, the best people are going to leave and the worst people are going to stay.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you know when you're going through and doing all the screening and that you're screening for the right things?
Well, this is what I had to deconstruct, and I had to look at performance differently. And a lot of times we get seduced when we look at or try to define performance. We get seduced by what's visible, and what's visible are often those skills. How well does someone do this or do that, or shoot a gun or skydive in the SEAL case? And what I needed to really kind of dive into and deconstruct was that, in fact, that's not what we were looking at. We were looking for these attributes, these hidden qualities, these unique things about a human being that tells us, can this guy do this? Does this guy have what it takes to do this job? These attributes. And a couple stories that I can kind of relate. First of all, when during basic SEAL training, you spend hundreds of hours running around with big heavy boats on your head. You spend hundreds of hours exercising with 300-pound telephone poles and running around with those things and freezing in the surf zone. At the time when I took over this training, I had been a SEAL for almost 14 years. I had done hundreds of combat missions up to that point, thousands of training evolutions. And I can tell you, never on one did I ever carry a heavy boat on my head or a 300-pound telephone pole.
Right.
So I knew what they were doing to us in that training wasn't teaching us those skills to be Navy SEALs. They were basically teasing out these attributes. And so I kind of really had to start thinking, okay, how do we start looking for these attributes instead of these skills? The other story I'll tell that kind of really hammered this home for me is a kind of a story that comes from before I went to SEAL training. So back in the 90s, one of the first things that you had to do when you showed up to Navy SEAL training, and this is buds now, was to swim 50 meters. So you jump in the pool, you swim 25 meters to one end and then 25 meters back. The story goes, this kid shows up and it's his turn to swim, and he jumps in the pool, and when he jumps in, he sinks to the bottom immediately. And then he just starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one side, and then walks across the bottom of the pool to the other side. He comes up, he's gasping for air, nearly drowning, and the instructor looks at him and says, "What the hell are you doing?" And the kid, who's still out of breath, looks at the instructor and says, "I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim." And the instructor pauses and looks at him for a second and says, "That's okay, we can teach you how to swim." Right. And so the question is, why does the instructor do that? Or did he do that? It's because the instructor knew that if this kid had those attributes, those qualities, those balls, if you will, to show up to Navy SEAL training and he didn't know how to swim, he had everything inside of him that we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was the easy part. And so what I had to do was kind of start to ask ourselves, or help us ask ourselves, okay, take away the skills. What are we actually looking for? What are the qualities we're actually looking for in candidates? Situation awareness, task switching, resilience, adaptability. And then where can we start to see those in our training pipeline? You can see these attributes most viscerally during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty, which made our crucible great, because everything about what we were doing was throwing guys into stress, challenge, and uncertainty. So these attributes, really, as long as we started looking for them, we could see them very viscerally, and then begin to say, okay, that dude, even though he may not be the best shot, which, by the way, when I went through selection, I was one of the worst shots, right? Even though that dude might not be the best shot, that dude has everything we need, right? So we can always teach him how to shoot, but that dude has everything we need to have him be a part of this team. And so this is when you start getting to that distinction between attributes and skills.
It's interesting that an organization could be as successful as the SEALs without, from the get-go, being consciously aware of the attributes required for success in that organization.
Yeah.
And that's true with anything. It's true with life. It's true with companies. Like, there are things that are required to be successful that we figure out along the way, and you kind of know them before you're conscious of knowing them, right? So the SEALs were screening for these attributes without necessarily knowing that they're screening for these attributes.
Yes, 100%.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I actually call it unconscious genius, right? And this was Draper Kaufman, who was the father of all the Navy SEALs. He was tasked in the 40s, it was 43 or so, to create a naval combat demolition unit. These guys, basically, when they were starting to plan the amphibious invasion, which they knew, they're planning D-Day, they knew based on previous big failures of World War I, Gallipoli to be one of the biggest examples. That they knew they needed guys who could swim ashore prior to the invasion and map out pathways, destroy obstacles, destroy mines, and things like that, so that the Allies could come ashore. And so Draper Kaufman, who had put together an EOD school previously, he was tapped to do this, and he didn't have a lot of time. And so basically what he did is he said, okay, I'm going to get a bunch of dudes and I'm going to start training by having them go through the hardest week I can possibly imagine. Where they started on a Sunday evening and they went until Friday afternoon, and they didn't sleep at all. I mean, they slept for 2 hours, maybe the whole week. They did combat simulations. I apologize for that noise. I live near a jet base, by the way. So what you hear right now are Navy F-18s taking off. So,
well, of course you do. Why would you live anywhere else?
So he created this week, ultimately nicknamed Hell Week, and when he did this, he conducted no exams, no tests, nothing. There was no pass fail. The only criteria was that someone had to stay or go, and it was that person's decision. Would he quit or would he stay? And 90% of the guys quit. And so in Kaufman's unconscious genius, he created this environmental event, and this is of deep uncertainty, deep challenge, deep stress, to tease out these attributes. And that's ultimately what ushered in, the NCDUs became the UDTs, the underwater demolition teams, and then from the underwater demolition teams came the Navy SEALs. And to this day, Hell Week is still the crucible. Every single Navy SEAL you'll ever meet, or UDT, or any of the old guys, we all have that commonality as we go through that Hell Week and SEAL training holistically. But that is the crucible, and those attributes are teased out. And so it was a flicker of unconscious genius there.
Is that week near the beginning or the end of
yeah, it's right now. It's the 5th week of training. So guys will start. They'll do a bunch of stuff, and then week 5 you'll go through Hell Week. And if I recall correctly, it was 5th week even when I went through. And then after that, and BUDS is really 3 phases. First phase where you have you have 4 weeks, then you have Hell Week, and then you have a couple more weeks of stuff. Second phase is all diving and underwater stuff, and then third phase is all land warfare, demolition, and weaponeering and things like that. So that's kind of the sequence, and has been for many years.
So after leaving the Navy, you focused a lot on the working on these attributes still and bringing that to the rest of the world. What was that like? I mean, obviously you were aware of the attributes that were necessary for success when you were in the Navy. How did you go about translating that to the general public?
It's one of the things I love to do the most, and that's taking experiences that I've had, especially in that environment, and kind of ubiquitizing them into everyday stuff. And with the attributes, it wasn't as difficult as one would imagine, because what the attributes tell us is how we show up, what our elemental human performance is. In other words, I'm really fascinated with human performance, but I'm really fascinated with human performance at an elemental level. In other words, who are we at our most raw, right? Because again, we all hear it's like it's only during times of deep stress and challenge and fear and things that the real us shows up. And I'm always like, well, okay, who's the real us? Because if we know who the real us is, now we know how we're going to operate in stress, challenge, and uncertainty. Now you know what people are made of, and you know how to create the highest performing teams. And so for me, that meant getting down to those elemental factors, and these attributes are very elemental. They come before, attributes come before everything. Attributes inform our values, which informs our helps inform our belief systems and our emotions and our personalities, right? These are all developed, but these attributes are very elemental because we can see them in very small children, right? All of us who are parents know that there are some small kids who are patient, and there's some small kids who are impatient, right? Or adaptable or not adaptable. So certainly there's a nature nurture, because environments can do matter. But what I did is I said, well, listen, let me take these attributes I worked on in the teams, and let me just talk about optimal performance, and how do we as humans perform optimally? What does that take from an attribute perspective, and talk about that. And then of course it really translated and translates to this day to the work we do with businesses, because what we can do now is we go into teams and organizations and say, we help them figure out what attributes they need for their organization, for their team, because that list is going to look a little different. Again, it's subjective, right? The list of attributes that make up a great SEAL team is going to look different than a list of attributes that makes up a great accounting team or sales team or surgical team. So,
for sure.
So we can help and use these same processes to help organizations and teams figure out exactly what they're looking for on their teams. And that's been really fun.
Yeah, I was laughing when you were talking about children who have these attributes. So, my jujitsu coach, he was a former UFC fighter, and he has 4
Mhm.
kids. The youngest child, I think I met this little boy when he was like 2, and he was the toughest of all of the kids at this
Yeah.
gym. And he would just run around. He'd bang his head into a bench, get a cut in his forehead. He would never cry. He'd just get. I've never seen that kid cry, and I've seen him like, bust up his whole body head to
Yeah.
toe. He'll just dive off things. Like, he's just trying to hurt himself. And it's funny because you're like, that's what everybody in the gym, we just imagine that's what our coach was like when he was a little kid. Like, you have to be
Yeah.
that way, to go willingly get punched in the face for
Yeah.
a living. You got to be the type of kid who's willing to take a beating and not
Yeah.
cry about it.
100%.
And he was so young that it's like, you can't possibly have taught this
That's right.
kid to behave
That's
this
right.
way. There's no way. He just has it or he doesn't. And we're not all going to be fighters. That's fine. But those of us who are going to be fighters, you better hope you were like that as a kid.
I would always say we're all fighters, but we fight in different ways, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And it depends on how we.
Not all of us fight
Depends on how we show
with
up,
fists.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. So with the attribute work that you're doing, you're talking about how it informs values and informs emotions. It almost sounds like, it sounds very positive in a sense that, okay, hey, if I can understand this, then I know how to best utilize my own God-given abilities. It also sounds a little bit hopeless if you don't have those abilities or those attributes. So what do you do if you're in a position where you're running a company or a team or what have you, and you go, you know what, maybe I don't have the attributes to be the leader.
Yeah. I like to describe us as automobiles, and it's not just because, kind of like the movie Cars. And it's not just because my kids maybe watch Cars 1,000 times. It's actually a good movie, but it's because it's very relatable to kind of us as human beings. We're all automobiles, but we all are different types. Some of us are Jeeps, some of us are SUVs, some of us are Ferraris, right? And the Ferrari, and there's no judgment there because the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do, and the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do. Okay. But we have to lift our hood and figure out what engine we're running with, because we may be a Jeep that's trying to run on a Ferrari track. Okay. So that's the first thing. First of all, there's no judgment with how we show up. Chances are, if you find yourself in a position where you're on a team or you've created a team and suddenly you're in charge of a team, chances are you probably already have a lot of the attributes that got you there in the first place. There might be a couple you need to develop, but that's okay. Developing an attribute is possible if you're low on one. And again, I want to just make sure I clarify for the audience that all of us are born with all of these attributes. Okay. So it's not like we don't have them. All of us have all of them. The difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each. So I usually use adaptability as an example. So if 10 is high and 1 is low, I would probably be a level 8 on adaptability, which means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Right. Someone else might be a level 3, which means the same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow and roll with it. They're still adaptable because human beings are, but there's just more friction with them. So if we were kind of lying all of these attributes on a wall like dimmer switches, all of our dimmer switch settings would be different. Those settings start to speak to how we perform, especially during stress and uncertainty. And chances are, and oh, by the way, it's not to have a lot of all of them is also not good. Too much and too little of each one can be bad, right? In other words, if you have way too much courage, it probably means you're not assessing risk properly. If you have way too much adaptability, it probably means you're a limp noodle, right? And low is the same thing. But the idea is, even in specific niches, right? Having too much of one attribute might be detrimental to your specific niche. I usually use the stand-up comic as an example of this. A stand-up comic with too much empathy is not going to be a good stand-up comic, right? Because how can you find funny at a funeral if you have too much empathy? All right, so you have to. So
are people finding funny at a funeral?
Comics are.
Okay, I remember, that's why I'm not one.
I remember actually listening to a couple comics talking, and they were talking about the fact that when they hear that someone has died, even one of their famous friends, right? They don't. No one else knows this, but in the first 10 seconds, they have like the first 3 jokes. Like they immediately think of jokes, right? So, and even I would even say as a Navy SEAL, too much empathy as a Navy SEAL, when you go to combat, actually would have been detrimental to me doing my job, right? So I had to. Yeah. So what everybody has to understand is that if you're in a position, first of all, you have to look at what got you there. What got you there probably are some of the attributes that make you need to be there or should be there anyway, you're probably looking at maybe developing one or two. And so developing an attribute is a little bit more difficult. Like you can't do it the same way you could do a skill. And the way I'll explain this is that if you want to determine whether it's a skill or an attribute, is you ask yourself this question: can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, it's probably a skill. If the answer is no, it's probably an attribute. So the example would be both of you say, Rich, we want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a bullseye every time, right? I could take both of you to the range and teach you how to do that within 2 hours. Okay, that is a skill. Okay. Or you say, Rich, we want to learn how to be more patient. All right, I can't teach you how to be more patient, right? So to develop an attribute takes 3 criteria. First is you need to know you need to develop it, right? So you need to know knowledge. Second is motivation. You need to want to develop it. And then third is a willingness to deliberately step into environments of discomfort so that you can test and tease that attribute out, right? So in other words, if someone wants to develop their patience, they have to go find environments that test and tease their patience, whatever that looks like for them. Okay, it could be go deliberately drive in traffic. It could be I'm going to stand in the longest line at the grocery store. I often say have kids. That'll develop your patience, right? So, but you have to find those environments that tease and develop that attribute, and you will then develop it. But the good news is,
I cringed at waiting in line at the grocery store.
Yeah,
I'll put stuff back on the shelf and go home.
I've done that.
Yeah, screw it. I don't need this.
Yeah. Do you ever?
We're the least patient people you might talk to.
If I'm at a gas station and I put my card in and it says go see the cashier, I just drive away. I
didn't need gas that bad.
No, I'll just go somewhere. It'll happen later.
What's interesting is in the book I talk about the kind of there's a set of attributes. The first 23 or 22 or so are ones that, in general, being a little bit higher on is a good thing, right? But then there were a few there that I talked about that when I did the math and I put them through my mental algorithm, it didn't come out the same way. Patience was one of those things, and the idea was there are highly successful patient people and there are highly successful impatient people. So in other words, being highly impatient isn't a bad thing, and being highly patient isn't a bad thing. You could be either one. And so
there's a difference in being rude and impatient.
100%.
Yeah, and I think people get that confused a lot. Like when people tell me to be more patient, it frustrates the heck out of me, because usually it's first of all, it's like telling someone to chill out. It's like, no, I'm not mad, but I'm pissed off. Like you tell me to be patient, 99% of the time, like we're on the same boat. It's like you and I, Rich, we're driving through the same traffic, or we're dealing with the same thing together. And my impatience is like expressed towards something that could easily be solved, right? Like you have a gas station, you want me to spend money here, and your card system doesn't work. Well, I'm impatient. I'm impatient because it could be better.
You're impatient with inefficiency.
I'm impatient with inefficiency.
I've had this conversation. I had to think deeply about this because I am a patient person, but I am guilty of exactly what you're talking about. And so the question became, when I was talking about this and kind of dissecting, is it's really a frustration that we're feeling with inefficiency. I'm not sure if that's patience, or I'm not sure if that's impatience as much as it is frustration, because patience is really, are you able to delay gratification for the period of which you need to accomplish something or whatever? Can you delay gratification in kind of certain environments, or do you need it kind of right now? Is that what does that feel like for you? Okay, I'm someone who can typically, I'm okay delaying gratification. It doesn't irk me. My wife, on the other hand, she finds it hard to delay gratification, right? So now the cool thing is, when you have a team, the best teams actually have both polarities on them, because when you have a team environment, in a certain situation, patience might be required. So the person who's patient steps up and takes lead, whereas in other environments, impatience might be required. So the person who's impatient steps up to take lead. So it's really more about those tendencies, because again, I think, like my wife jokes, he's like, well, you're not patient at all, especially when you're driving. And it's true. But when I thought about it, it's because I get frustrated when I'm driving, because I see people not paying attention, and that's delaying my progress, right? So that's not necessarily impatience as much as it is frustration. But this is why attribute stuff really fascinates me, because there's so many nuances here. And when we really start to dive into it, we start to understand our performance at levels that we never really did before. And that's really, that keys me in, right? Really incredibly. I get excited about that stuff.
So speaking of the nuances of those, I would think that one of the things that makes the SEALs successful is it's not just the physicality of it. And if it were, we would just have a CrossFit competition, take the top 100 competitors and go, you guys are Navy SEALs. But there's something about thinking differently, thinking in the face of uncertainty. And it inherent in any sort of decision, there's an element of that uncertainty. And you've got to be able to deal with that uncertainty and that stress and volatility and so forth. What have you noticed about the Navy SEALs and how they're making decisions that are going to be superior or allowing them to be successful?
Yeah, what a great question. I'll just say that it's almost not at all about physicality, right? I mean, because, and this is where athletes get torn up, and we have, even when I went through, but Division I athletes will come to SEAL training. They'll be the first ones to quit, because what they do at SEAL training is they take you down to 0, and then they say, okay, now go. Or even sub-0 and say, now go. And so it's all about the mental game. And I'm glad you brought that up, Sean, because it's actually, this is going to be my second book. I'm starting it right now, but Navy SEALs are what I've always described them to be. In other words, it's not about shooting. It's not about skydiving. We are masters of uncertainty. And that means we are individuals and teams that can drop into deeply complex environments and figure it out and perform. Okay. And the way we do that is because we have a process by which we can calm our autonomic arousal systems. We can start looking at our situation and environment. We can start deconstructing. We start chunking known elements and start moving through step by step an environment that's deeply uncertain. And this is what masters of uncertainty do. And I've started to break down these things into steps in terms of, because everybody can be can become a master of uncertainty. It's really about understanding our own makeup and our own physiology. But part of understanding how to do that is first understanding what engine we're showing up with. So in other words, I need to understand that if I'm low on adaptability, when the environment starts changing around me outside my control, it's going to feel difficult for me. And I need to know that. I need to know where my engine's going to start to feel a little friction, so I can understand where my friction points are going to be, so I can start understanding how to move through an environment more successfully. But it is almost entirely a mental game. And this is what SEAL training does. SEAL training throws you into, and this is why a lot of us would show up at SEAL training. We say, well, look the top physical dudes, and they all quit, right? It's because they're going to throw you into environments where, I mean, it feels like there's nothing left. You can't get any more tired. You can't get any colder. It feels like you're going to literally die, right? And you keep pushing through. And the way you do that is you start using your brain in ways that you can start really stepping through that piece by piece. And that's the real secret to SEAL training. But it's also, in essence, the secret to life in terms of making it through uncertain, challenging environments.
When you talk about knowing those attributes, my guess is that there are some of these that weigh heavier on the decision-making competency than others.
Yes.
Do you notice some of those?
And those are really the mental acuity attributes. So in the book, I talk about 5 categories. I say grit, mental acuity, drive, leadership, and team ability. Just by the way, one of the leadership attributes is decisiveness. Okay. And the reason why it is a leadership attribute is because, and by decisiveness as an attribute, it's not about making decisions. Because again, if we think about making decisions, decision making is a skill that can be taught. You can teach someone how to make better decisions. Decisiveness adds an element of efficiency and speed to that process, right? So in other words, the best leaders have a way of making decisions with the sense of element or with an element of efficiency and speed. That goes back to these mental acuity attributes. And these mental acuity attributes are situation awareness, compartmentalization, task switching, and learnability. And so the reason why these feed into a decisive process, or even a decision-making process is a little bit more rapid, is because it's how our brains basically deconstruct the world around us. All right. So situation awareness is, in essence, our ability to notice things about our environment. Okay. Those of us who are really high on situation awareness, we notice a lot of things. Okay. We're almost hyper vigilant in some ways. And so we're taking in a lot of information. Compartmentalization is really the key here, because compartmentalization allows the individual to say, okay, based on everything I'm seeing right now in my environment, what are my priorities? What's that list look like? And what do I need to focus on right now? And then once I pick something, I focus on that until it's complete. And then I task switch to the next thing and focus on that until it's complete. And I task switch to the next thing. And as I'm going through that process, my learnability is kicking in, because I'm taking constant assessment whether or not my last action is working, or do I need to change action? So So decision making becomes a mental game. It's almost an external expression of this internal processing that our brain is making, where we're taking all of our environment. We're saying, okay, out of everything that I see right now, what do I understand? Let's prioritize what I understand. Let's focus on the number one priority. Do that. Let's pull back out again, ask the question again, pick our next number one priority, focus on that, and make decisions that way. And so that's how I describe the decision-making process and the decisiveness attribute in kind of an attribute way. It all stems from the way your brain can process the world.
So some people are not necessarily going to be adept at doing that without work or training. What can someone focus on who wants to get better at that level of decision-making?
Yeah. First thing someone can focus on is managing their autonomic arousal. So in other words...
Yeah, you said that earlier. What the heck does that mean?
So we have our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system has two parts, a sympathetic and a parasympathetic. Okay, sympathetic is really our action-oriented system. It kicks in when we're doing things, especially when we're under stress and challenge. We start to get cortisol hits and adrenaline and things like that. It's the very active part. When we're really in high sympathetic response, we're getting a lot of cortisol, getting a lot of adrenaline. We're moving through what we need to move through at a higher stress level. But it's also a little bit more destructive to our system. In other words, I shouldn't say destructive, it's hard on our system. So to counter that, we have our parasympathetic system. The parasympathetic system, known as the rest and digest system. Okay, shift into parasympathetic. That's when our body's recovering. Okay? Instead of cortisol, for example, we're making DHEA, which is kind of rebuilding and regenerating. As we go into autonomic arousal, autonomic arousal is really as we start to get anxious and fear starts to enter our system, our amygdala starts to tickle and our autonomic arousal goes up. Okay, as our autonomic arousal goes up, our sympathetic response goes up, and our amygdala starts to sense more and more threat. The higher that goes, the more we head into what's called amygdala hijack. Okay, what does that mean? That means that as that autonomic arousal goes up, our frontal lobe, conscious thinking mind, is actually starting to go offline. All right, to the point where if we're into massive fear, our conscious mind is almost totally offline, and we're just going we're acting without thinking. Okay, so we're basically. This is the idea of touching a hot stove, all right, and immediately you pull your hand away, okay? We don't have to think about pulling our hand away. Our brain immediately says, threat, pull your hand away. It doesn't wait for our logical conscious mind, okay? But in environments of high stress, right, our arousal is going to go up, and automatically, as we start to get more stressed and more anxious, our conscious mind is start to go offline. And so what we have to start understanding how to do is bringing our anxiety levels down, bringing that frontal lobe back online, because it's only through our frontal lobe and our conscious mind that we can actually start decision making and processing our environment. We can do that several ways. You can do that. There's visual tools you can use to bring down your stress and anxiety. There's breathing techniques you can do. Once you bring that autonomic arousal back down, you then begin to ask questions about your environment that allow you to start helping step through it. Okay. First question, automatic, is, what about this do I understand? That list might be small, right? It might be like one or two things. Again, what you're doing is you're picking focus points, all right? And then you say, okay, from that list, what do I focus on in this moment? This is how I kind of almost call this adjusting your horizons, right? So in other words, you're picking a focus point that's meaningful to you, and you're moving to that. And then what's happening is as soon as you hit that, you're generating a reward system in your brain. You get a dopamine reward for that, which allows you to come back and say, okay, what's my next horizon? Let me give you an example from SEAL training. Okay, SEAL training, again, like I said, you run around for hours and hours with boats on your head and on the beaches of Coronado, especially during Hell Week in the middle of the night. I can remember during Hell Week at one point, we're running on the beach with our boats on our head. We've been doing it for hours, right? And I don't know what god-awful time it was. We hadn't slept. And we're running along a sand berm just along the beach. And I remember being miserable, and I said to myself, oh, man, okay, you know what? I'm just going to focus on the end of this berm, getting to the end of the berm. And that's what I did. I just focused and I got to the end of the berm. What I did without knowing it is I just picked a horizon. All right. And I moved. And as soon as I got to the end of that berm, I was like, oh, cool. Okay. And I gave myself, unbeknownst to me, of course, until I studied the neuroscience later on, I gave myself a dopamine reward, which allowed me to pick a new horizon. And I picked a new horizon and moved to that. Those horizons that you pick are entirely up to you in terms of duration and length and what they are. So, for example, some guys will say, well, I just thought about making it to the next meal. Whereas other guys, like, you're freezing in the surf zone, sometimes like, I'm just going to count to 10, right? That's my horizon, right? So in in any challenging, uncertain environment in terms of moving through it, it's going to be about understanding your environment to at least a small degree, so you can pick a horizon, you can move to it, you can generate a reward in your brain and your biochemistry. You can come back out and do it again. You start stepping through, and these are micro decisions that you're making as you move through, which are very effective, especially during deep and challenge and stress.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the neuroscience behind it, but I did that during Ironman triathlons. So no matter how fit you are, something's going to go wrong. Either, you get cramps, you get blisters on your feet, it's hot, you're sweating too much, what they didn't have pretzels at the last aid station. Like there's always something that's just, there's always something that you go, oh my gosh, I could quit. I would set little markers, and in the swim, it's hard because you don't have any visual cues. Right. So I would just count strokes, and then I would like think of a number. And sometimes it'd be like a fun number, like, what's my address? Okay. So then I'm going to count strokes up to my house number. Or whatever, like just so it wasn't just counting 100 strokes and then counting 100 strokes again and then counting 100 strokes again forever. You're like, oh, well, I'm going to count 1,004 strokes. Yeah,
something that's meaningful
whatever
to you.
It happened to be.
That's right. Well, what you're doing then, what you're doing effectively, what you were doing is you were practicing compartmentalization, because this is what compartmentalization is, and what it means is you're basically you're chunking your environment, you're setting and picking horizons that you move to. You're creating dopamine rewards when you do it, and then that allows you, once you accomplish that goal, to do it again. And this is the way we can practice it.
Man, this is what frustrates me with what my industry does is, in the financial planning industry, the entire value proposition is we're going to help you meet your goals. Well, like goals are a tool to get you somewhere that you want to be. Goals are not
bigger than the goal.
Yeah. The goal is not for the sake of having the goal. Like you should have goals, but the goals are for the purpose of compartmentalization, and they can be really small and silly. It can be to the tune of, I'm going to count 100 swim strokes.
Absolutely.
And I'm going to make it there. So it could be, I'm going to save, whatever number, this amount of money this year. If that's the only thing you've got going to save, $100,000 this year or whatever it is, you're not going to end up anywhere, and you're not going to stick with it, and you're going to quit. But I'm counting the swim strokes so that I can be an Ironman, so that I can finish this hours-long race. I'm setting the goal of saving $100,000 this year so that I can do something else. And it's not so I can buy the house, or so I can start a business, or so I can do that. Because even those things, although they're more complex goals, they have to be attached to something that's more meaningful.
Well, they're
than
too
them.
big. This is kind of you can't eat the whole elephant, right? And the saying at SEAL training, especially during Hell Week, and Hell Week starts on a Sunday, it ends on Friday. The saying is, if you think about Friday on Monday, you will quit. Okay, you're not going to make it through. You can't. I didn't even think about Friday until Friday morning, right? Because you always have to take it to bite-sized elements. It's too big. I remember talking to a guy at one of my talks, and he came up. He said, Rich, I was formerly obese. I was just super overweight, and he was a marathon runner, by the way, by that time. And he said, and he became a marathon runner. I said, listen, tell me, how did you do it? What did you do? He said, well, the first thing I did when I made a decision, the first thing I did is I said, okay, I'm going to order a pair of running shoes. Right. Step number one, right? Mm-hmm. Running shoes sew up. Oh, cool. Okay. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to put the running shoes by my bed. Gets up, the running shoes are by his bed. The next morning, I put on the running shoes and walked to my front door. That's what he did. Next day, he walked out of his front door to his mailbox. Next day, he walked from the mailbox to the end of the street. Next day, from the end of the street to the end of the neighborhood, whatever. Slowly, over the course of days and weeks, began to slowly start running, then jogging. He ended up being a marathon runner, okay? He started by ordering a pair of running shoes. That was his very first goal, all right? So what you're saying is so true. He said his overall goal was to run the marathon, just like it might be someone to buy the house or get the retirement home or whatever. But you have to chunk it down, because if you don't chunk it down, you're not creating reward systems that'll.
And if you sit there and go marathon every day, especially when you're not in a position to even
you can't even run.
You can't even run a mile. Then it's demotivating. 100%. So that's so fascinating. I think that's another one of the unknown knowns, the things that we know that we're not really sure that we have to know. And as an industry, I think certain people are kind of coming aware and going, oh, you know what? Goals for the sake of goals was not really what the higher purpose of this work was. You said something a second ago that I want to highlight, mostly because it helps me feel better about myself. So did we have this?
Need a lot of that.
Yeah, I every day. Did we air that guy? Okay. I didn't want to say his name, but we recorded an episode with a guy who came on, and we didn't air it because we didn't think it made any sense. We're like, this, I think he's full of it. One of his big messages was decisiveness is not that good. Oh. And he said, well, we praise people for making quick decisions, but they need to be more thoughtful and need to really take a slow approach because quick decisions can hurt. And these are all of the ways that being decisive is harmful. And we were kind of looking at each other. We're super decisive. We're very we've taken assessments that say you are the 1% of decisive people.
A lot of efficiency and speed in those decisions.
And that's some of it is our impatience showing, as we're just going to, I'm willing to be wrong. I'm willing to make a decision and be incorrect, but I'm not going to sit here and just wait forever. So I had to say that because I thought,
well, really I would say because I would say decisiveness, and again, I would agree with you. I disagree with this guy because I think what this guy doesn't realize is everything we do is a decision, right? And sometimes, and this would happen in combat too. Yes. Sometimes the decision is to do nothing. Sometimes the decision is to wait, right, and stop.
That better be a conscious decision,
right?
though.
Yeah, but again, even again, we're making unconscious decisions all the time too. So we have to recognize those. Especially when we're starting to act, without thinking. So this fight or flight thing. We're either freezing or we're either stepping in or freeing or fleeing. The key is also accountability. I mean, you have to buttress every decision with accountability, because if you don't, you're not effectively analyzing the effects of those decisions. Right? You make a decision, you own it. You start running down that pathway and you say to yourself, okay, how's this working? Oh, it's not working? Okay, I'm going to make another decision, right? I'm going to change. I'm going to do whatever. But everything we do is a decision. Every single thing we do, whether unconscious or conscious. And I think the power in what you all talk about is that the more we can take control consciously of our decision-making process, the more successful, the more powerfully, the more efficiently we act as human beings. And this is how the highest performing teams operate. The highest performing teams, the masters of uncertainty, we've all gotten to a position where in the deepest, most dire, most dangerous circumstances, we manage ourselves, so we're making decisions. Sometimes those decisions are as little as, I'm going to count to 10 right now, but that's still a decision. Okay. Yeah. And so I think you're absolutely right. Life is about making decisions. And yeah, of course, sometimes decisions should be made more thoughtfully, but again, that's going to be based on what decision it is and what type of information you're gathering. And the decision might be, we're going to wait for more information on this one. That's the decision. So
waiting on accident is harmful. Waiting, not right now. Well, I'm not sure. Well, I don't know.
And I would almost say, that's not even on accident as much as it's on fear. A lot of times people they delay because they fear making a movement. They fear making the wrong movement. And gosh, I mean, I'm a real believer that sometimes the right pathway is not going to even show up until you move far enough down the pathway to see it. Right? You have to go over that next hill to see what other pathways there are, which means you have to start moving, right? Because you're not going to figure it out unless you do, and you can't do that unless you start making decisions.
In SEAL work, there's a lot of, I would think fear. I mean, if somebody's not afraid, they maybe haven't assessed the risk, but there's got to be a lot of uncertainty. There's got to be some anxiety that goes along with that to create that fear. How do you overcome that if you are in an uncertain situation where you're having to make a decision?
Yeah, the first way you do it is because you've built a team that operates with immense proficiency and competency. In other words, we attain mastery of some of our basic things. And the SEAL teams was always like shoot, move, and communicate. We master those skills of shooting, moving, and communicate to the extent we don't have to think about them, which means that frees up our mind to start dealing with the uncertain environment. And then what we'll do is I think we get really good at doing this unconsciously, is again, the decision-making process is first, number one, it's, okay, I'm going to collect all the information I can or that's available to me. Okay, that's the first thing we do. Whether it's a protracted decision where you're really collecting stuff, or it's a very rapid decision where you're saying, what about this environment do I understand? what information do I have available to me right now in this moment? Okay, based on that information, what's the priority list based on what I want to accomplish in this moment? Boom, boom, boom. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's move on that first priority. All right. This process is basically buying down risk to a certain degree. But the other thing that I think you get very good at is being okay with risk. Okay, we often call it the 80-20 rule, right? We never ever had 100% intelligence on a target. Okay, ever. All right. So our whole thing was, listen, as long as we have a percent, it doesn't even have to be 80%. As long as we have enough of percentage to allow us to decide something, let's just go ahead and move. Okay, a perfect example of this, and really kind of a phenomenal one, was President Obama's decision to go send our guys to go get bin Laden, right? This was, and I know this because I've, again, I was not on that op. I was at the command, but I wasn't on that op. But I know all the guys who were my friends, so I know what happened in that room. This was 100% a 50-50 thing. Okay, in other words, when they were deciding whether or not to send guys, 50% of the room was saying, nope, we should drop a bomb. 50% was like, I think we can send guys, right? So what the president had to do in that moment was say, okay, 50% at a 50%, what do I want to do? I'm going to make a decision. And so all of our decisions, we basically calculate the risk to a certain degree, and we say, okay, what risk am I accepting of? And I think in the SEAL community, you're often, depending on the mission, willing to accept higher amounts of risk than maybe the normal person. And then you mitigate those risks just by really training as much as you can in as many things that you can anticipate without kind of what ifing it to death. But another great example, kind of in a microcosm, is jumping out of airplanes. We used to jump. I mean, we jumped out of airplanes all the time, right? And sometimes it'd be 22,000 feet. We'd be jumping out to do skydives in the middle of the night, loaded with gear, with night vision, right? And so we always used to joke, it's like, and we trained on this stuff. We knew what we were doing. We trained. We understood the emergency procedures. We said, okay, there's about 5 or 6 emergencies that typically happen in any skydiving. So I know what those are. I know what I'm going to do if that happens. But there's a whole host of unknowns. And you know what? I'm just confident that when I get out there, if something happens, I'll figure it out. All right. Because at the end of the day, you're still throwing yourself out of an airplane. We always joke, like, jumping out of airplanes is like committing suicide and saving your life every time, right? I mean, it's that intense. There's always a chance. But you do that, you say, okay, I'm just going to practice. I'm going to be clear on the knowns, and I'm going to be okay with the unknowns, and then move. And for every single person, that percentage level is going to be different based on the environment, based on the decision, based on those who are at stake, who have something to gain or lose in the environment, right? So in other words, we may not be willing to accept as much risk with our family in making a decision as we might with my SEAL platoon brothers, right? I mean, depending on what it is, or in a business scenario. So it's about weighing those percentages, but not expecting 100%. We're never going to get 100%. So we have to pick the percentage of risk that we're comfortable with and go with that.
I love that. Everything's risky. Not everything is jumping out of a plane risky, but everything is risky. There's a risk to not jumping out of the plane. Yeah. There's investing is risky, not investing is risky. Starting a business is risky, not starting a business is risky. Joining the SEALs is risky, not joining the SEALs is risky. What would your life have been like if you didn't do that? I learned a lot. You have incredible insights, Rich. I appreciate you being here, sharing them with us. We got to get you out here because you've got something on your calendar. Where can people find you and get more in tune with the work that you're doing?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Theattributes.com is where all of our stuff is, and they can visit that. They can see some assessment tools for measuring their attributes. We're putting together a Masters of Uncertainty journey. If someone wants to go on that journey, they can start going down that road. They can figure out the book, get me on social media and all that stuff. But that went fast. I appreciate the conversation with both of you. So thank you for having me.
Rich, thanks so much for being here. I'm not sure if I've had a discussion that had more takeaways than that discussion.
There were a lot.
There were a lot. If I had to boil it down, I would say that my takeaway is around building that mental acuity and focusing on situational awareness, compartmentalization, tasks switching, and learnability. Doing that can help that mental acuity. and looking at how you avoid that amygdala hijacking, using breathing exercises and thought exercises to avoid that, where your amygdala takes over and you're just in fight or flight, and allowing that frontal lobe to do the decision making. And I think if you're situationally aware, you're able to compartmentalize things, you're able to focus on the task at hand and able to sort of learn what you're supposed to learn from those, you can prevent that amygdala hijack that he was talking about.
Autonomic arousal, not a phrase I'd ever heard before.
No.
My biggest takeaway was on compartmentalization. It wasn't necessarily an entirely new idea, but it was presented in a way that was fresher and allowed me to take away more from it. So when we are making decisions, we can compartmentalize those big choices or big goals into smaller decisions. And I think that is to frame that in the sense that it's an attribute instead of like a skill. It was really interesting. Like it's not something, I mean, yes, you can get better at it, but it's something that you should be doing. You should be someone who is compartmentalizing. That's helpful instead of saying, oh, well, should we compartmentalize this skill to this decision? That,
right.
Thinking of it that way is like something you do instead of who you are, I think is to minimize it. So that was a big help for me. And I'm already thinking of how I'm going to implement that. And when we make big decisions, instead of trying to like solve it all at once and make all of the choices
bite-sized pieces,
it's, well, what's the one decision I would have to make to start down this road? That's really helpful. You just made a great decision to listen to this episode of Decidedly. Make another great decision and leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. We appreciate your support. It helps others find our community and defeat bad decision making in their own lives. For more daily decision making insights, check us out at decidedlypodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram at Decidedly Podcast. Thanks again for listening. I'm Sanger Smith, and this is Decidedly.
Insights, advice, and comments provided by Sean Smith, Sanger Smith, and speakers identified as part of the Decidedly podcast should not be considered recommendations. Speakers not identified as members of Decidedly are expressing their opinion, and their statements should not be construed as reflecting the views of the Decidedly team. This podcast is produced solely for informational purposes, not personalized advice.